A boy can survive hunger, cold, and fear, but the first clean thing he touches after years of ruin may break him completely. Germany, April 1945. The morning light came thin and gray over a temporary holding camp near the Elbe River, where the road had turned to soft mud under the boots of too many tired men. The camp was not built to last. Nothing was, anymore. A few canvas tents leaned against the wind. A line of wooden posts held wire that sagged in places. An American truck idled beside the yard with its engine coughing low, and behind it stood a metal water tank polished by rain until it caught the pale sky in dull silver patches. The prisoners had been told to form a line. Most obeyed quickly, not because they understood the order, but because they understood the sound of authority. They were German soldiers in name, though some were too old, some too sick, and one was barely more than a child. His name was Lukas Weber. He was 16 years old, though his face had learned the stillness of someone much older. His uniform coat hung from his shoulders like it had been made for another body. The sleeves swallowed his wrists. Mud had dried along the seams, hardened in ridges. His boots were cracked at the toes, and his hands stayed folded tight against his stomach, fingers hidden under the cuffs, as if even his own skin needed protection. When the American soldiers opened the valve on the tank, the sound was small at first. A metal turn, a cough in the pipe, then water spilled into a wooden trough, clear enough to show the grain beneath it. The prisoners stared. Some leaned forward. One man crossed himself. Another whispered something in German that disappeared in the cold air. Lukas did not move. He stood 5 feet from the trough and watched the water as if it were not water at all, but a trick arranged for people desperate enough to believe in miracles. For years, water had mint-brown puddles and shell holes. Melted snow strained through cloth. Rain caught in dented cans. Anything swallowed before the dirt settled. Clean water belonged to kitchens, to Sunday shirts, to a mother's voice from a room that no longer existed. It belonged to before. Around him, men began to step closer. They dipped their hands, splashed their faces, drank from cupped palms. The sound of it was almost unbearable. Water against skin. Water against wood. Water falling back into itself. Lukas felt his throat tighten, but not from thirst. He remembered a white bowl on a table in Leipzig. He remembered his father's pocket watch resting beside a folded newspaper. He remembered his mother tapping his knuckles with 2 fingers and saying, "Clean hands before bread." The memory came so quietly that it hurt more than shouting. An American sergeant across the yard noticed the boy who would not come forward. Sergeant Thomas Walker lowered the clipboard in his hand and studied him for a moment without speaking. The others saw a prisoner. Walker saw the way the boy's eyes stayed fixed on the trough, hungry and terrified at once. Not terrified of punishment, terrified of wanting something. The sergeant took one slow step toward the water tank, then another. He removed his gloves, set them on the edge of the trough, and placed both of his own hands beneath the stream. He washed them deliberately, turning his palms, rubbing water across his knuckles, letting it run down his wrists and darken his sleeves. Then he lifted his wet hands where Lukas could see them. No speech, no order, no smile meant to soften the moment. Only proof. The water kept running, bright and cold in the gray morning, and the boy stood still, breathing like someone at the edge of a door he was afraid to open. Walker did not move closer. He had learned, somewhere between France and the German border, that frightened people sometimes needed distance more than comfort. He kept his wet hands raised for another second, then lowered them slowly and stepped away from the trough. The space he left behind was not large. 3 feet of muddy ground. A strip of cold air. The kind of distance a grown man could cross without thinking, and a starving boy could stand before as if it were a river. Lukas looked at the sergeant, then at the water, then at the other prisoners who were washing now with the urgency of men trying to remove more than dirt. No one laughed at him. That made it worse. Laughter would have been familiar. Mockery had rules. Kindness had none. A man beside him, gray at the temples and shaking from exhaustion, whispered in German that it was safe. Lukas heard him, but the words did not settle. Safe was a word adults used before doors closed. Safe was what officials said before trains left stations. Safe had become too large a word for a boy who had watched every ordinary thing disappear by inches. He remembered Leipzig in winter, not the city of ruins, but the city before the windows were taped and the shelves went bare. His father had repaired watches in a narrow shop that smelled of oil, brass, and cigarette smoke. Customers came in with pocket watches, mantel clocks, alarm clocks with tiny silver bells, and his father would lean close with a glass lens over one eye, listening to the small heart of each machine. Time, his father used to say, was not loud. It only became frightening when people stopped listening to it. Lukas had not understood then. He understood too well now. His childhood had not ended in one day. It had ticked away. One ration card, one missing neighbor, one classroom closed, one uniform issued too soon, one photograph folded into a coat pocket until the corners softened. He looked down at his hands. They were still hidden in the sleeves. He had not truly looked at them in weeks, maybe months. They had become tools for carrying, digging, holding, waiting. He no longer thought of them as a boy's hands. Walker saw the hesitation and reached for nothing. Not his rifle, not the boy's arm, not even the canteen at his belt. He only pointed to the water, then to his own clean palms, and said one word in a low voice. Clean. Lukas knew that word. Every schoolboy knew a little English from scraps of lessons, songs, signs, the kind of language that survived even when countries stopped speaking to each other. Clean. It sounded smaller than sober, softer somehow, as if the word itself did not want to frighten him. The water ran over the trough and made a thin line through the mud, cutting a clear path toward Lukas's boots. It touched the cracked leather and darkened the dust there. Lukas flinched. Then he stared at the market. Left. The water had come to him first. No command, no punishment, just water finding the lowest place, as water always did. He took one step. The yard seemed to quiet around him, though it did not truly go silent. Trucks still idled. A tent rope tapped against a pole. Somewhere behind the mess tent, a metal pan clattered. But near the trough, every sound thinned into breath. Lukas took another step. His right hand came out from under the sleeve. The cuff stuck for a moment against dried mud, then slipped back. His fingers were narrow, red at the joints, the nails dark with weeks of earth and ash. Walker's face changed, but only slightly. A tightening near the eyes. A held breath. Lukas noticed because children notice what adults try to hide. He almost pulled his hand back. Then he remembered his mother's kitchen again, the round loaf cooling under a towel, the knife beside it, the way she would not cut bread until every hand at the table had been washed. Not because the family had much, because little rituals kept people from becoming less than themselves. Lukas reached out one finger. The stream touched his skin. Cold, sharp, real. He jerked back at first, startled by the clean sting of it. The other prisoners watched without speaking. Walker lowered his gaze, giving the boy the dignity of not being stared at by the man who had made the moment possible. Lukas tried again. One finger became two. Two became the whole hand. Water moved through the cracks in his skin, under the nails, across the lines of his palm. Dirt loosened in thin brown threads and disappeared into the trough. Beneath it, pale skin appeared, almost unfamiliar. He turned his hand slowly, watching it return to him. Not healed, not strong, only visible. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Then his left hand rose too, trembling worse than the right. He placed both hands beneath the stream, and the cold ran over him with the gentleness of something that did not know who he was supposed to be. For a few seconds, Lukas only watched his hands. The water kept moving over them, carrying away the dark lines that had settled into his skin for so long they had begun to feel permanent. Mud loosened from beneath his nails. Dust lifted from the creases of his knuckles. The stream was cold enough to make his fingers ache, but he did not pull away. Pain from cold was clean. It had edges. It belonged to the body, not to fear. He turned his palms upward and stared at the pale map of lines there, as if someone had placed the hands of another child at the end of his sleeves. Walker stood several feet away, still as a fence post, giving the boy the room to discover what had been returned to him. Around the trough, the other prisoners slowed. A few lowered their eyes. One older man pressed his wet hands to his face and kept them there. No one spoke. The morning held its breath in pieces. The idling truck, the small rush of water, the soft shift of boots in mud. Lukas rubbed one thumb across the back of his other hand, testing the skin. The motion was careful, almost formal. He was not washing quickly like the others. He was learning the shape of himself again. Then the memory came stronger. His mother standing near the stove in Leipzig, sleeves rolled to her elbows, flour on one cheek, her hair pinned too loosely because she was always moving. The table had been small. The kitchen window had looked down on a narrow street where bicycles leaned against brick walls and neighbors called to one another before supper. His father would come upstairs from the watch shop with the smell of brass and machine oil clinging to his coat. Lukas would try to reach for the bread before washing, and his mother would catch his wrist, not hard, never hard, only firm enough to stop him. Clean hands before bread, she would say, not because bread was plentiful, because bread was sacred when there was little of it, because hands, even small hands, should meet food with respect. At the trough, Lukas pressed his lips together, but the memory had already opened something inside him. His chin trembled once. He tried to stop it. He looked down harder, as though discipline could hold back what water had started. A tear fell from his face into the trough and vanished without a sound. Then another. His shoulders folded inward. He did not sob loudly. He did not make a scene. The crying came quietly, like the first leak through a roof after winter, small at first, then impossible to deny. Walker looked away at once. Not from discomfort, from respect. He turned his head toward the gray field beyond the wire, where spring grass was beginning to show through the mud. He had a younger brother back in Iowa who had been 15 when Walker left home, all elbows and appetite, always forgetting to shut the barn door, always washing his hands too fast before supper. For one strange moment, the distance between Iowa and Germany did not feel like an ocean. It felt like a kitchen table. Lukas tried to speak. The first attempt failed. He swallowed, keeping both hands under the water. Then he lifted his face toward Walker, eyes red, cheeks wet, voice so thin the sergeant nearly missed it. "My mother," he said in English, each word separated by effort. She said clean hands before bread. Walker did not answer immediately. There was no answer large enough for that sentence. The boy was not asking for pity. He was not explaining himself. He was bringing a small, ordinary law from a vanished room and laying it in the cold air between them. Clean hands before bread. A rule for a household. A rule for children. A rule for a world that still believed tomorrow would have a table, a loaf, a mother watching from the stove. Walker reached into the pocket of his field jacket and found a folded handkerchief, white once, now worn soft and the color of old cream. His own mother had tucked it into his bag before he shipped out, telling him a man should always carry something clean, even if the world did not stay that way. He held it for a moment, feeling the thin cotton between his fingers. Then he stepped forward only far enough to place it on the wooden edge of the trough, beside the running water. He did not put it in Lukas's hands. He did not make the boy accept it. He simply left it there, within reach, and stepped back again. Lukas stared at the cloth. He understood enough. Not the words behind it, not the life in Iowa, but the gesture. Something clean, offered without command. Slowly, he lifted his dripping hands from the stream. Water ran from his fingers in bright lines. He picked up the handkerchief with both hands, careful not to grip it too tightly, and pressed it once against his palms. The cloth darkened where it touched him. Walker looked at the boy then, and the boy looked back. Neither smiled. Neither needed to. The water kept running between them, cold and clear, carrying nothing important away. The handkerchief stayed in Lukas's hands longer than it needed to. He did not wipe quickly. He pressed the cloth to each finger, one by one, as if speed would disrespect the thing that had just happened. The cotton was thin from years of washing, soft in the way old household things become soft when someone has cared for them. It smelled faintly of soap, wool, and the inside of a field jacket. Nothing in that smell belonged to the war. That was what made it difficult. Lukas folded it once, then again, trying to return it to the clean square it had been, but his fingers shook too much. Walker saw the struggle and said nothing. He had already given the boy the cloth. To correct him now would have turned kindness into instruction. Instead, he looked toward the mess tent, where 2 American soldiers were carrying a crate of bread from the back of a truck. The loaves were round and plain, wrapped in brown paper, the kind baked in quantity for men who cared less about taste than warmth. Steam rose faintly when one wrapper tore open. The smell crossed the yard before anyone spoke. Bread. Not cake. Not feast. Just bread. But the prisoners felt it the way dry ground feels rain. Their heads turned. Their bodies leaned toward it before discipline pulled them back into place. Lukas turned too, still holding the handkerchief. The scent reached him and settled behind his ribs. For a moment, He was not in the muddy yard. He was standing in the Leipzig kitchen again, too small to see over the table, waiting while his mother tapped flour from her hands and his father wound a clock by the window. Clean hands before bread. The sentence moved through him like a bell struck under water. Captain Edward Harris came out of the tent with a clipboard tucked under one arm. He was a tall man with silver beginning at his temples, the kind of officer who had learned to keep his face calm because men watched it for weather. He saw the prisoners gathered at the trough. He saw Walker standing near the boy. He saw the wet handkerchief in Lucas's hands. Harris stopped for half a second, just long enough to understand that something had happened without needing anyone to tell him what it was. Then he gave a small nod toward the bread crate. "Feed them after they wash," he said. His voice was practical, almost ordinary. That made the order more powerful. Not feed the strong first. Not feed the men who could work. Not feed them after inspection. Washington. Then bread. A rule simple enough to rebuild a room around. Walker stepped aside as the prisoners began to form a new line, slower this time, less like men obeying and more like men remembering. Hands entered the water. Faces bent over the trough. Sleeves were pushed back. Dirt clouded the surface and drifted away. No one rushed Lucas. He stood at the end, watching the others, the handkerchief folded carefully against his chest. The older man with gray temples came first for bread. He held out clean hands, still wet, and received half a loaf. He looked at it with a hard, blank expression, then lowered his head. The next man did the same. One by one, the line moved. Walker handed out bread without speeches, placing it into open palms as if there were a right way to give food to a hungry enemy, and the right way was quietly. When Lucas reached him, the boy did not lift his eyes at first. He held out both hands. Clean now, red from cold, too narrow for the sleeves around them. Walker placed a piece of bread across the boy's palms. It weighed almost nothing, but Lucas held it like something breakable. He did not bite immediately. He looked at the bread, then at his hands, then at the handkerchief tucked under one thumb. His lips moved with words Walker could not hear. Maybe a prayer. Maybe a name. Maybe only the old sentence again. Then Lucas broke off the smallest piece and ate it slowly. His eyes closed, not from pleasure exactly, but from recognition. Bread after water. Food after dignity. A world placed back in order by two ordinary things. Walker turned away before the boy could see his face change. Across the yard, the Elbe moved beyond the trees, hidden but present, carrying spring water past fields and villages and broken roads towards some place no one in the camp could see. The morning remained gray. The mud remained deep. The war had not vanished. But beside a metal tank and a wooden trough, a boy had washed his hands before eating, and for one quiet minute, that was enough to make the world feel less ruined. By midday, the holding camp had settled into a rhythm that was almost peaceful because no one trusted it enough to call it that. The water tank stood near the yard with its valve closed now, silver sides dull under a blanket of low clouds. The trough remained full. Bits of loosened dirt had gathered at the far end, where the overflow cut a thin channel through the mud and disappeared beneath the wheels of the American truck. Lucas sat on an overturned crate beside the mess tent, the piece of bread resting in his lap, both hands wrapped around it, as if warmth might escape. He had eaten half and saved half without deciding to do so. Hunger told him to swallow every crumb. Memory told him to keep something for later. That was what the last years had taught him. Save. Hide. Fold small things into smaller places. Trust nothing that could vanish. The handkerchief lay across his knee, drying in the cool air. Its edges fluttered whenever the wind passed through the yard. He looked at it more than he looked at the bread. The cloth had become difficult to understand. It was not valuable in the way food was valuable. It could not fill the stomach. It could not open a gate. It could not change the number written beside his name on the processing sheet. Still, Lucas felt that if he lost it, something important would be lost with it. Sergeant Thomas Walker was across the yard helping Captain Harris count the new arrivals. A table had been set under a canvas awning. Names were taken. Ages were written down. Towns were mispronounced and corrected in quiet voices. The work was ordinary and slow, pencil against paper, paper against clipboard, the small machinery of order trying to begin again. Walker glanced once toward Lucas and saw the boy sitting, with the bread untouched. He almost walked over. Then he stopped. There were ways to help that looked like pressure when a person had been given too little choice for too long. So he stayed where he was and let the boy keep his silence. A few minutes later, a young American private named Daniel Reese came out of the mess tent carrying a tin cup of warm coffee. He saw Lukas and paused. Reese was only 19, with freckles across his nose and a helmet too large for his narrow face. He had been told all his life to respect children, old people, and anybody hungry enough to stare at food before eating it. He crossed the yard carefully and held out the cup. Lukas looked up, startled. Reese pointed to the steam and then to his own mouth, making a drinking motion. Coffee, he said. Warm. Lukas understood warm. He understood the shape of the offer, even if the word coffee sounded strange in the private's accent. He looked past Reese toward Walker, as if asking permission from the only American whose kindness had already been proven by water. Walker saw the look and gave one small nod. Lukas accepted the cup with both hands. The metal was hot against his clean palms. Not burning, just hot enough to make his fingers wake. He brought it close to his face and breathed in. Bitter, dark, real. The smell pulled another room from the past, not his mother's kitchen this time, but his father's workbench below the stairs, where a cup of coffee always cooled beside tiny screws and watch springs. His father never drank it while it was hot. He forgot time while fixing time. Lukas almost smiled at that, but the expression broke before it formed. Private Reese did not wait for thanks. He backed away, embarrassed by the boy's carefulness, and returned to the tent as if he had only moved a cup from one place to another. That was how the Americans did it, Lukas began to notice. The best ones did not make a performance of mercy. They placed a thing near you and gave you room to remain proud while accepting it. Bread in open hands. Water before a command. Coffee without a question. The afternoon cooled. A light rain began, so fine it barely made circles in the trough. Prisoners shifted. Under the awning. Some held their bread under their coats. Others tilted their faces upward and let the rain touch them. Lukas stayed on the crate. Rain landed on the handkerchief, darkening it again in small, uneven dots. He reached to protect it, then stopped. It was only water. Clean water falling from the sky with no one deciding who deserved it. He unfolded the cloth across both knees and let the rain settle on it. Walker watched from the table. He did not smile, but his shoulders lowered slightly, as if something inside him had unclenched. Captain Harris followed his gaze and saw the boy, the bread, the cup, the cloth spread open under the rain. For a while, neither man spoke. Then Harris said quietly, not as an order and not as a report, he is too young to look that old. Walker kept his eyes on Lukas. Yes, sir, he said. The rain continued. The yard softened. Mud gathered around the boots of prisoners and soldiers alike. And beneath the awning, while names were written and bread was divided and coffee cooled in tin cups, Lukas Weber sat very still, letting clean rain touch the cloth from Iowa, as if the sky itself had joined the small work of giving something back. The rain lasted less than an hour, but it changed the smell of the camp. Dust became earth. Canvas became wool. The wooden posts darkened, and the wire held small beads of water that trembled whenever the wind moved. By late afternoon, the clouds lifted just enough for a dull strip of sunlight to appear beyond the trees, turning the puddles pale gold at their edges. Lukas remained near the mess tent until Captain Harris ordered the prisoners moved into the larger canvas shelter for the evening. No one hurried them. That alone felt strange. Men rose stiffly, gathering bread crusts, tin cups, and whatever small scraps of themselves the day had not taken. Lukas folded the handkerchief from Iowa into a careful square and slipped it inside his coat, not deep enough to hide it, only close enough to keep it from the mud. The cloth rested against his chest with a weight far greater than cotton. Inside the shelter, rows of straw mattresses had been laid along the ground with enough space between them for narrow walking paths. The place smelled of damp canvas, wet boots, and soup heating somewhere outside. A stovepipe rose through a patched opening in the roof. The fire inside the small iron stove was modest, but the warmth reached slowly, touching ankles first, then knees, then hands. Lukas sat on the edge of a mattress near the back. He kept his palms open in his lap. They were still clean in the lines, though the rain and the yard had left faint shadows of dirt along the wrists. He looked at them the way a person looks at a photograph from childhood, recognizing the subject and not recognizing the distance. Across the shelter, An older prisoner coughed into his sleeve. Another man unwrapped his saved bread with the seriousness of someone opening a letter. Near the entrance, Private Daniel Reese checked the stove and left without speaking. The canvas flap fell behind him, and the shelter settled into a low murmur of German voices. Lukas did not join them. He was listening to the sound of the water tank outside. Even with the valve closed, it made occasional ticks as the metal cooled. Small sounds. Familiar sounds. His father would have noticed them. His father noticed every small sound. The tick of a watch. The scrape of a chair leg. The soft click of a lid closing on a tin of screws. Lukas reached inside his coat and touched the folded handkerchief. For the first time that day, he wondered what had happened to his father's shop after the family left it. He imagined the workbench still there under dust, the magnifying glass, the green-shaded lamp, the drawer where old watch faces were kept. He imagined time sitting in pieces, waiting for hands patient enough to put it back together. The thought did not crush him as it might have that morning. It only made him tired. A clean kind of tired. Outside, Walker stood under the awning with Captain Harris while the evening roster was checked. The sergeant had washed his own hands again before supper, though they had not been very dirty. He did it without thinking, then noticed himself doing it and stopped for a moment under the thin stream. Water ran over his knuckles, over the scar from a barn latch back in Iowa, over the place where his mother's handkerchief used to sit in his pocket. He had carried that cloth across states, across an ocean, across roads whose names he could barely pronounce. He had not meant to give it away. He had simply known, in the space of one breath, that the boy needed something clean more than he needed a keepsake. Captain Harris watched him from the table. "Your mother will forgive you," Harris said quietly. Walker looked over, surprised. Harris nodded toward the empty pocket. A man does not carry a handkerchief that long unless somebody put it there with love. Walker dried his hands on his trousers. "Yes, sir," he said. "I suppose she will." Harris glanced toward the shelter where Lukas sat hidden among shadows and low voices. "There are going to be many boys like him before this is over," he said. Walker followed his gaze. The tent flap moved in the wind, opening just enough to show a strip of warm light inside. "I know, sir." Harris folded the roster and tucked it under his arm. "Then we had better remember how to begin." He walked away before the words could become sentimental. Walker stayed by the trough. The water had cleared again after the afternoon washing, reflecting the dim sky in a narrow silver rectangle. He thought of Lukas's sentence, each word carried with care across a language barely known. "My mother said clean hands before bread." It was not a military report. It was not a confession. It was the smallest constitution of a lost home. That evening, when the soup was carried into the shelter, the prisoners lined up without being told. Lukas stood with them. Before taking his cup, he stepped once more to the basin near the entrance, where a little water had been poured for washing. He cleaned his hands first. The older man behind him watched, then did the same. Then another. Then another. No officer ordered it. No guard announced it. The line simply changed. Hands before food. Water before bread. A quiet rule returned to men who had lived too long without ordinary rules. Walker saw it from the doorway and did not enter. He stood outside in the cooling air while steam rose from the soup cups and the first evening star appeared over the Elbe, small and steady, like something still keeping time. By the next morning, the camp had changed in a way that would not have appeared on any military report. The tents stood in the same places. The wires still sagged between the same wooden posts. The American truck remained beside the water tank, its tires sunk an inch deeper into the softened ground. Yet something had shifted under the ordinary movements of the day. Men woke before they were called. They folded blankets with a care that seemed almost ceremonial. They brushed straw from their sleeves. They lined up near the basin by the entrance and waited for water before breakfast, not because a guard told them to, but because Lukas Weber had done it the night before, and the older men had followed, and the rule had passed among them without needing a name. Lukas was near the front of the line, holding the folded handkerchief against his coat with one hand and his tin cup with the other. His face still looked thin in the pale morning, but his eyes were less guarded. Not open. Not yet. Only less closed. When the basin came to him, he poured a little water over his fingers and rubbed carefully between each one. The movement was small, patient, almost like prayer. Behind him, the gray-haired prisoner copied him. Then another. The sound of washing moved down the line in soft fragments. Water in tin. Skin against skin. A sleeve pulled back. A quiet breath. Sergeant Thomas Walker stood 30 feet away with Private Daniel Reese, watching the line form itself into something human before the day had even begun. Reese held a crate of bread against his hip and looked puzzled in the honest way young men look puzzled when they witness something older than their own experience. "Nobody told them to do that," he said. Walker kept his eyes on Lukas. "No," he said. Reese shifted the crate. "Then why are they doing it?" Walker took a moment before answering. "Because someone remembered." The private looked back at the prisoners, not understanding completely, but understanding enough to become quiet. Captain Harris came out of the command tent, buttoning his jacket, a pencil tucked behind one ear. He saw the line at the basin and stopped as he had stopped the day before, not long, only enough to let the image enter him. Then he took the pencil from behind his ear and wrote something on the bottom of the roster. Later, Walker would see the note. Additional wash basins requested. Soap if available. No explanation. No sentiment. Just a practical order shaped by what one boy had shown them. Breakfast was thinner than supper had been, bread and hot cereal with a little salt, but no one complained. The prisoners took their food in clean hands. Lukas carried his cup to the edge of the tent and sat where the morning light reached the ground. He ate slowly, saving nothing this time. The hot cereal warmed his throat. The bread was plain and slightly dry, but it broke easily between his fingers. He looked at his hands each time before lifting food to his mouth. The habit had returned faster than hope. Hope was dangerous. Habit was safer. Habit could begin with water. After breakfast, Walker approached him for the first time without an object to offer. No cup, no bread, no cloth, just the sergeant himself, moving slowly enough that Lukas had time to see him coming. The boy stiffened, then made himself stay seated. Walker stopped several feet away and pointed lightly toward his own chest. "Thomas," he said. He waited. Lukas looked at him. The name hung between them, simple and unarmed. The boy touched his own chest with 2 fingers. "Lukas," he said. Walker nodded once, as if the exchange had weight. It did. Names were different from numbers. Names belonged to kitchens, shops, schoolrooms, mailboxes, mothers calling from doorways. Walker pointed toward the handkerchief, then toward Lukas, and shook his head gently when the boy tried to pull it out and return it. "Keep it," he said. Lukas understood the gesture more than the words. He looked down, then folded his hand over the cloth through the coat. "For me?" he asked softly. Walker nodded. "For you." The boy did not thank him. Not aloud. He only held the cloth and looked toward the water tank, where the silver side caught the morning and broke it into a dull shine. A wagon rattled beyond the road. Somewhere across the field, a church bell rang once, then stopped, perhaps. From habit, perhaps because someone had found the strength to pull the rope. Lukas listened until the sound faded. Walker listened too. For a moment, neither was soldier nor prisoner in any simple way. They were 2 white faces in a gray German morning, standing on opposite sides of a war that had made both of them older, while clean water waited nearby in a wooden trough. Then Captain Harris called Walker back to the table, and the day resumed. Papers moved. Names were checked. Food was counted. But Lukas remained seated in the strip of light with both hands clean around his cup, and when the wind lifted the tent flap, he did not flinch. By afternoon, the request Captain Harris had written at the bottom of the roster became something real. A jeep arrived from the supply depot 3 miles down the road, its tires throwing wet grit along the path, its back seat loaded with canvas sacks, dented basins, and a wooden crate marked with the plain black letters of military inventory. Soap. Not much of it. Not the smooth bars wrapped in paper that belonged on store shelves back home, but rough yellow blocks cut unevenly, smelling of lye and clean laundry. Private Daniel Reese carried the crate to the trough as if he were carrying ammunition for a different kind of war. The prisoners watched from the shelter entrance. Soap had become almost harder to understand than bread. Bread answered hunger. Water answered thirst. Soap answered something quieter, something people could live without, yet should not have to. Captain Harris lifted 1 block, turned it in his hand, and looked toward Walker. "Make it last," he said. Walker nodded. He set the soap on the edge of the trough, then took a knife and cut the first block into smaller pieces. The blade moved slowly through the dense yellow surface. Each piece fell with a soft thud onto the wood. Not enough for everyone to keep. Enough for everyone to use. Lukas stood near the back of the line, one hand inside his coat, touching the folded handkerchief through the fabric. He had not meant to become someone the others watched, but by then they did. Not openly, not with pressure, just with the quiet attention men give to the first person who steps onto thin ice and does not fall through. When Walker lifted one small piece of soap and held it toward him, Lukas felt every eye settle. He stepped forward, careful in the mud. The soap looked ordinary in the sergeant's palm. A blunt yellow square, rough edges, a faint crack across the middle. Lukas reached for it, then stopped before touching it. His hands were not filthy anymore, but they were not as clean as they had been that morning. He looked toward the trough. Walker understood. He placed the piece on the wood instead of into the boy's hand. Choice again. Always that small space where dignity could stand. Lukas rolled up his sleeves. The cuffs resisted, stiff with old mud, but he worked them back until both wrists showed. He dipped his fingers into the water, lifted the soap, and rubbed it between his palms. At first, nothing happened. Then a thin white film appeared. Then bubbles. Small, fragile, almost ridiculous. A few clung to his knuckles. One slid along the line of his thumb and trembled there before breaking. Lukas stared at it. Bubbles. In another life, children made them in kitchen sinks and laughed when they floated into the air. He had not thought of that in years. He rubbed harder, and the scent rose. Plain, sharp, clean. It entered his nose and crossed time faster than memory should have been able to travel. A washroom in Leipzig. A towel hanging by the stove. His mother scrubbing a collar at the basin. His own shirt sleeves damp from playing near the pump. He swallowed and kept washing. This time he did not cry. Tears had marked the first return. This was different. This was practice. A person could not live forever inside one broken moment, even a holy one. He rinsed his hands and stepped aside, leaving the soap on the trough for the next man. The gray-haired prisoner behind him hesitated. Lukas looked at him and nodded once. Not as a boy asking permission, as someone passing on a rule. The older man took the soap. Soon the line moved. Hands entered water. Soap passed from palm to palm. Foam gathered, thinned, vanished. The trough became cloudy, then cleared again with each fresh pour from the tank. Walker watched the small ceremony and felt something in it that no report would hold. They had not rebuilt a town. They had not brought back anyone's family. They had not undone a single mile of ruin. They had put soap beside water and let men wash before supper. Yet the camp seemed steadier for it. As evening came, Lukas sat near the shelter entrance with his sleeves still rolled up. The air was cool against his forearms. He held the handkerchief in his lap, now dry, folded neatly along the old creases. Private Reese passed by with an empty crate and paused long enough to look at the boy's hands. Clean, Reese said, smiling before he could stop himself. Lukas understood that word now in more than one language. He looked at his palms, then at the private, then toward Walker by the trough. Clean, he repeated softly. The word did not erase what had happened to him. It did not make him innocent of the uniform he wore or free of the country that had used him, but it gave him a place to begin again that was smaller than politics and stronger than shame. Water, soap, bread, a name spoken gently, a handkerchief kept close to the heart. The sky darkened over the Elbe, and the first lamps were lit inside the shelter. Their light fell across the mud in narrow golden strips. Lukas stepped over one of them as he went inside for supper, careful not because the light could break, but because something in him had started to believe that ordinary things deserved care. That night, the camp grew quiet in layers. First the trucks stopped moving. Then the voices near the command tent faded. Then the last metal cup was rinsed and turned upside down beside the basin, where drops of water ticked softly into the mud below. Inside the shelter, men settled onto straw mattresses with the careful movements of people who had learned not to take rest for granted. Lukas lay near the back with his coat folded beneath his head, the handkerchief tucked inside his shirt where it would stay dry. The cloth touched his chest each time he breathed. It was not warm, not exactly, but it held the memory of warmth, and that was enough. He listened to the night beyond the canvas. Wind in the wire. A guard walking slowly past. The river somewhere in the dark, moving without hurry. He thought of Leipzig again, but the memory no longer arrived only as loss. He saw his father bending over a watch with a lamp shining on the workbench. He saw his mother placing bread on a small table and looking at his hands before letting him sit. He saw himself younger, impatient, ordinary, Annoyed by rules he would one day miss more than gifts. His throat tightened, but he did not cry this time. He only placed one clean hand over the handkerchief and kept it there until sleep came. The next morning, Captain Harris received orders to move a portion of the prisoners west to a larger processing camp. Names were read after breakfast under a sky washed pale by rain. Lukas Weber was on the list. So was the gray-haired man who had stood behind him at the basin. The men gathered their few belongings in silence. There was not much to gather. A blanket, a cup, a heel of bread wrapped in paper. For Lukas, there was also the handkerchief from Iowa, folded now with the precision of something repaired. Walker stood beside the truck as the prisoners climbed into the back. He checked names against the roster, his pencil moving steadily until Lukas reached him. For a moment, the boy stopped at the tailgate. He looked smaller against the truck bed, but not as lost as he had looked 2 days before. His sleeves were rolled neatly. His hands were clean. The handkerchief made a small square shape beneath his coat, near the heart. Walker held out his hand, then stopped halfway, unsure whether the gesture would frighten him. Lukas saw the hesitation. Then, slowly, he offered his own hand. The handshake was brief. Cold fingers. Light pressure. Nothing dramatic. But Walker felt the boy trying to stand inside the gesture like a man, and he accepted it that way. Thomas, Lukas said, carefully, using the name as if it were a borrowed tool he did not want to damage. Walker nodded. Lukas. Private Reese stood nearby with the empty bread crate under one arm, watching the exchange with his mouth pressed closed. Captain Harris gave the order to load. The gray-haired prisoner helped Lukas climb up. The truck engine started with a rough cough. Mud trembled beneath the tires. As the vehicle began to move, Lukas turned once. He did not wave. Neither did Walker. Waving belonged to train platforms, front porches, schoolyards, places where people expected to meet again. This was not that kind of parting. Instead, the boy lifted one clean hand and placed it over the hidden cloth at his chest. Walker understood. He touched 2 fingers to the empty pocket where the handkerchief had been and held them there until the truck passed beyond the bend in the road. Years later, when Lukas would speak of that spring, people expected him to remember dates, armies, flags, the large words history gives to the end of a war. He remembered smaller things. The silver side of a water tank. The first sting of cold water on cracked skin. A piece of bread placed into open palms. A rough yellow square of soap shared down a line of silent men. An American sergeant who set his gloves beside a trough and proved kindness without demanding trust. Lukas never claimed that water saved him. Water could not return a city. It could not bring back a kitchen, or a father's watch shop, or a mother's voice at supper. But it gave him one true beginning. Before freedom, before papers, before home became a question no map could answer. There was a morning in a muddy camp near the Elbe when clean water touched his hands and reminded him that he was still allowed to be human.